said, I'm Keith Johnson. I've got Devium Wine in Walla Walla, Washington. I'm also a winemaker and a small partner at Sleight of Hand Cellars, which is why you see the Sleight of Hand barrels behind me here. I've been making low intervention wines in Walla Walla since 2015 was my first vintage. My project is very, very small. Started with about 100 cases in 2015, and I make, I don't know, 800 cases now. So very small production, working with vineyards that interest me, and making wine as with as little intervention as possible, and the goal being zero intervention when it suits the wine that I'm making. The project really started off, I was a bit rebellious because I just didn't see any of these themes and ideas being explored in Washington. Picking earlier, using less intervention, no new oak, things along of those sorts. And so at the beginning, it was kind of this way of pushing the boundaries and trying to do it differently. And that was how Devium started. But as it's evolved, it's become more of a philosophical project in exploring the bare minimum and the most distilled, in my view, pure version of winemaking that I can get to. And so that's kind of the idea. So again, I source from vineyards that I think have something to say, that have a point of view, and then I handle the fruit in as minimal a way as possible.
And what's the farming been like with the vineyards that you work with?
Yeah, so we are always pushing further and further towards organic. Everything I work with right now is sustainable, this is a complicated question, especially in Washington. Organic is not that widely utilized in Washington State, and I think it's becoming more and more prominent, but it's just not there yet. And so what I really look for is conscientious farming. I look for people who respect the land. I look for people who respect the vineyard. I look for people who respect their workers, and then utilize as little chemicals as possible. And so, for instance, most of my farmers are almost organic, but I've got one farmer, Damon Lalonde, who farms French Creek Vineyard, and he likes to rotate his sprays for mildew one extra time. And so his mode of action. And so once a year, he uses a synthetic spray for mildew. The rest of his program is all organic. But on the flip side of that, he's also spending fewer trips in the tractor up and down the rows. He doesn't use any fertilizer, doesn't use any pesticides or herbicides. And so I feel very, very comfortable with the way he's farming. And now, would it be great if I could say organic and talk about it being organic? Sure. But I'm willing to take that trade-off because of the respect he shows for the land, the fact he's not using herbicides or pesticides. All of the weed control is manual, usually with the crew going up and down the rows with hose, manually removing weeds. And again, he doesn't go up and down the rows with a tractor as often, and so we're using less fossil fuels, and so there's definitely a trade-off. But again, for me, it really comes down to conscientious farming, sustainability, and that extends from the way they treat the land, to the way they treat their crew, to the way they treat, the way they treat people in general is something that's important to me. And so one of my other farmers, Ryan Johnson, who has Weather Eye Vineyard, his vineyard team, on average, he's got a 16-person full-time vineyard crew. On average, they've been with him for 15 years is the average duration that they've worked with him. And they started out working for him at Ciel du Cheval, and they followed him from Ciel du Cheval to when he launched the Force Majeure project. And then when he left to start Weather Eye, they followed him again. And so to me, these are the things that I really look for in my farmers. And then he doesn't use pesticides or herbicides either. So, but he might use a synthetic spray for mildew. These are conversations we constantly are having. I'm always pushing for more organic use. But again, it comes down to what I'm comfortable with and people that are respectful of, again, the land and the people that work it.
Cool. And so could you, maybe we should start basically with how many wines do you make on average every year? Are there any wines that you make on a regular basis or more like seasonally or periodically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I make, how many wines do I make a year? I don't even know anymore. So we'll start. The first wine I ever made is the French Creek red wine. It's kind of the core of the production. It's the largest production wine I make. Co-fermented blend of Mourvedre, Syrah, and Grenache Blanc. The second wine I started making with my second vintage, I started taking one little block of my Mourvedre at French Creek and making it sans souf. And so I don't make that wine every year, but I make it in the years where the fruit health is what I'm looking for, and I feel like it's an appropriate thing to do. What was next? Next, I made some whole cluster pressed Pinot Noir as a project with a friend, and we did it jointly the first year, and then the second year we split it apart, and then this year, 2020, I actually got a new vineyard source for it. I make a skin contact Roussan from Weathereye Vineyard. I make a co-fermented Graziano Mourvedre Grenache Syrah from Weathereye Vineyard as well. And then I do some sparkling. So I've got 3 years worth of traditional method in tirage right now. I was planning to disgorge the first vintage, the 2017s, this winter, but I opened a bottle and felt it could use more time. So I'm giving it another year. And then I've been playing around with making a little bit of ancestral method pet nat from a vineyard planted at 3,000 feet elevation up in the Blue Mountains, just outside of Walla Walla. And that vineyard's planted the Malbec and Riesling. So the first vintage of the pet nat was 2019, 100% Malbec, and I made a still Riesling in 2019. And then this year I made a pet nat that's actually a blend. The Malbec yield was so tiny because of a big storm that rolled through during fruit set. I couldn't make a standalone wine, so I actually co-fermented Malbec and Riesling with about 5 days of skin contact for the 2020 pet nat. And then I made some sparkling Riesling as well. So I don't know, I make a lot of wines in very small quantities.
Get out of the business if you don't want to.
What's your general approach? Could you just take us through maybe just a general approach to how you make wine? How you approach making a wine?
Absolutely. So I pick early. Typically my wines are under 13% alcohol. That's another part of kind of my philosophy is questioning ripeness all the time. You get these people who think you've got to be, 26 bricks, 25 and a half bricks. And that is quote ripe. And then everything tastes like raisins. So for me, there's this idea of ripeness and what is ripe and what, and for me, that tends to be a couple of weeks earlier than most of my contemporary other people working with the same sources. So I pick my fruit nice and early, usually 12.5 to 13% potential alcohol. I bring the grapes into the winery. I foot crush them. Nothing is added. I put them into open top stainless steel bins. And then I wait for fermentation to start, and that's pretty much it. So once fermentation gets going, I will either, sometimes I punch down, sometimes I foot tread. It just depends on the lot, depends on how I'm feeling that day. Maybe once every other day, once a day, depending on fermentation. After 20 to 25 days, I'll press everything off, put it into old barrels, and then just let it rest quietly for 6 to 16 months, depending on the lot. And so typically wine dependent. I might, the one addition I do make is sulfur. I might add a little bit of sulfur post malolactic if I feel like the wine could use it, small amount, maybe 10 to 20 parts per million. And then typically I'm bottling somewhere around, the wines that I do add sulfur to, I add a little bit. Usually I'm bottling around 12 to 15 parts free sulfur and about 25 parts total at the time of bottling. And that's my winemaking. I don't fine, I don't filter, I don't rack. I let nature take its course. If I think something would be better suited to be cold stabilized, I stick it outside in a cold Walla Walla winter and let it do it naturally. And that's kind of my program. Pretty straightforward. I don't know. It's a matter, again, it's about distilling winemaking to me down to its purest form. And I just think that that's where I'm headed, and hopefully the wine's delicious too.
From taking this approach, since you were already making wine at sleight of hand, prior to kind of creating your own label, was there anything that you learned about the fruit in Washington that you didn't really maybe notice until you started making these less interventionist wines?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. What I've learned is that what's been really fascinating, I don't know if it's the stems inclusion. I mean, there's a lot of factors, but what I've really learned is that you can pick grapes much earlier and make a much lower alcohol wine in Washington. But our fruit is such high quality and has such good fruit weight that the wines don't come across as being they're not super lean. So even I'll bottle a 12% alcohol red wine and it comes across with good depth and breadth and good richness compared to if you did this other places. And again, I think that some of that is the stem inclusion because all of my reds are 100% whole cluster. And I think some of that is our basalt-based soils, which raise my pHs a bit and add some richness to the mid palate. And some of that's just, I think it's just Washington State sunshine. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. So, making wine in a more conventional style in Washington, the talk was always, you hang until 25, 26 bricks and you water everything back and you add a little bit of acid and that's how most people make their wine. And so it's been interesting to see the weight and the depth that I can get at lower alcohol levels, which I don't know, not many people have been exploring. Still not many are, but we're seeing more and more of that starting to happen.
Okay, well, let's
Here's a question for you, because I know that you've met Joe Swick, and you guys, like, I think Joe and you both were mentioning to me that in Washington, could you kind of maybe just give us a context for fruit being grown in Washington? Because I know there was something about you and Joe sourcing from like different parts of Eastern Washington. Is that right?
Yeah, so Joe is mostly working with fruit in the Western Yakima Valley, so near the city of Yakima. And he has found some people doing organic stuff over there and doing some really cool things. But that's an area of Washington I've never really explored. I'm Walla Walla based, and so.
So just to give us a context, so you're saying that there's like one main grape growing region in Washington, which is kind of the Yakima Valley, and then you're working more with the Walla Walla.
Well, so actually my fruit's mostly Yakima Valley, but I'm Eastern Yakima Valley. So I'm pulling fruit from the eastern edge of the Yakima Valley, which is quite long. Yakima Valley is like 60, 70 miles long. And so if I were to get fruit from where, for instance, Joe is sourcing most of his stuff, I'd be 2 to 2.5 hour drive to those sources. And I used to pull fruit from the Columbia Gorge, Celilo, and I actually stopped because of that drive, because I just didn't feel, it just didn't sit right. It didn't. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I couldn't be in the vineyard as much as I wanted to. I was driving all that time. I was using, fuel. I just didn't feel right about it. And so I have moved all of my vineyard sources within an hour of Walla Walla. Right now, that's kind of my comfort level. Maybe that's going to change someday. I don't know. So I source fruit. I'm not working with a lot of Walla Walla Valley fruit. In fact, I only make one wine that technically is Walla Walla Valley. Of course, I work with Lewis Peak, but it's not in the AVA. It's up too high, up in the foothills, but it's Walla Walla area. And then everything else is very eastern edge of the Yakima Valley.
Sounds good.
And the winery operation going on in the background is my assistant winemaker and a rabbi. We are making, for sleight of hand, we're making some kosher wine for a company on the East Coast. So they are topping our 2020 Lewis Vineyard kosher Syrah right now. So that's what we've got going on here.
So Luke, do you want to jump in here? I know you had some questions for Keith too.
Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how this works. Unmute.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, I'm. We talked about this when we first started working together. Like, can you kind of, I missed the first couple of minutes here, but I think to speak to maybe your original training and your inspirations for wine, like what kind of brought you into where you are right now. Just a little bit of the background, if you didn't already.
No, I haven't. We haven't gotten into that. So my background is I sold wine and beer, mostly Keystone Light, in Eastern Oregon for about a year and a half. I had gone to college and lost my way a bit and ended up in my hometown of Pendleton, Oregon, working for a distributor. During that time, I fell in love with the wine side much more than hand trucking stacks of Keystone Light into convenience store coolers. And so I started diving more and more into wine and learning and researching. And this would have been, I guess, 2008, early 2009. So during this time, my wife, we weren't married yet, but she was going to nursing school. And the idea was she would go be a nurse and I would go back to school, probably for, with the aim getting into engineering was the direction I was headed. Thank God that's not how it worked out. But we decided partway through when she graduated and had taken all of her tests, she decided she didn't want to be a nurse. And so she got a job in Walla Walla working for Charles Smith in his tasting room, and I enrolled in the enology and viticulture program in summer of 2009. So we moved here July of 2009. I started school that fall. I went to work at a local winery that I actually represented their wines, Savaya Cellars. During the 2 years of school, I worked full-time for Savaya in the cellar. And then when I graduated, I came to work at Sleight of Hand. And so 2011, I came on board at Sleight of Hand as the assistant winemaker. That's really where, I would say that's where the direction I've gone began. At the time, we were making our wines in a much more conventional way. And in fact, this is some
case production of Savaya, total case production versus Sleight of Hand, just to kind of compare, contrast.
Yeah, we're both, we're decent size for Walla Walla, but small in the scheme of things. So I've only worked in small wineries. Savaya, I think we were making about 20 to 25,000 cases when I was there. And Sleight of Hand, we're making about 10,000 cases. And that's the thing people don't realize is, so from the minute I started at Sleight of Hand, I think there was a, for both Trey and I, who we make the wine together, we both were getting more and more into drinking more interesting wines and obviously not going down the natural rabbit hole yet. That came later. In fact, that's still developing here in Walla Walla. But, we were drinking more and more interesting wines and inspired more and more by, classical Rhone producers and things of that sort. And so, with that, we're talking 2011, I was buying and drinking all the Chateauneuf de Pop I could get. Like that was my, I look back, I don't think I've bought a bottle of Chateauneuf de Pop in 6 years, but back then I was drinking a lot of it. And but what that does is it opens you up to more minimal winemaking, of course, because you start realizing these people that, not that they're natural or that they're non-intervention, but you start seeing the use of neutral barrels, native yeast, and spontaneous malolactic fermentation, and just a more rhythmic style of winemaking, and seasonality. So not forcing the issue with your malolactic fermentation and things of that nature. And so we both started pushing that direction. It would have started 2011, but 2011, I look back at the way we made wine at Sleight of Hand back then, and versus how we make it now, and the differences are shocking. We were buying all cultured yeast. We were buying malolactic bacteria. We were utilizing a lot of viticulture products that I don't even know how to use anymore. I haven't used anything like that in years. So, but we've really taken Sleight of Hand that direction as well. But what I do with Devium is I take it a step further, to especially in the use of sulfur and especially in the use of or lack of use of yeast nutrients. And then I also pick a lot earlier, and I don't use any new oak for the Devium wines. So, and that's, but that's really where it began. So it was more just a personal exploration of winemaking. And then sometime in about 2015, I started Devium and with the idea of being minimal intervention. But in 2016, 2017, 2018, there was, I started, kind of a philosophy of life of trying to simplify and distill life down to what's actually important. And the way I make wine copies that approach. And so I'm not always successful, but and I'm not always good at it, but it's something I'm striving for.
What are some things that have worked that you're continuing with into the future, that following that thread, and some things that did not work so well that you kind of decided not to repeat?
Yeah, so there are some things, a couple times I've tried to be a little too dogmatic, and really tried not to use sulfur. some wines have backfired a little bit. I wasn't respecting and giving enough support to my yeast sometimes. It's this relationship you've got to cultivate. And now I don't add yeast, of course, it's all spontaneous, but and I don't use yeast nutrients, but there are ways that you can make sure that your yeast are happy. And sometimes I neglected that, thinking that I was more bulletproof than I really am. And so I think just it's less a matter of things I tried and more a matter of paying more attention and being more understanding, being more aware of what's going on. And so I think that you can have it both ways. You don't have to intervene, but you have to be aware and you have to be present every step of the way. And so even though I'm not, punching down my wine all the time, I'm not racking it. I don't top very often, but I'm aware of what's going on all the time. And one other thing, I did put my 2017 French Creek Red, I put into concrete for a few months, and it went so reductive, I'll never do that again. It came around, but it went, I couldn't believe it within a week. It just didn't like the concrete. And so I backed away from that idea. It was just, you could tell the wine was angry about it, and it is what it is. So I moved it back into barrels, and it came back around.
Is there a use for concrete that you see for your wines in the future, or is everything going to be oak?
I have one small amphora, and I have obviously played around with concrete. I guess if you had asked me that question 18 months, even or 2 years ago, I would have said absolutely. I could see getting into concrete again, but I don't know. I've in the last couple of years, there's a magic to old barrels, and most of my barrels are very old. My Roussan's fermenting in 22-year-old barrels right now. So I just, there's a magic and a feel and a soul to old barrels that I I like concrete. I'm not anti-concrete. I love it for sleight of hand, but not for my project, I don't think.
Cool. Also, I think maybe talking about the individual vineyard sites and give us like a lay of the land, paint a picture of, where it is, how high it is, or, what kind of warmth or
yeah, absolutely.
the ambiance, and talk about the wines in the context of the place would be super interesting.
Yeah, so we'll start with French Creek, which is where it began. And so the reason I started, so in 2014, I knew I was going to be making some wine for myself in 2015, and I was starting to think about what vineyard sources I wanted to work with. And honestly, at this time, I had no varieties in mind. I had no sources in mind. I had no, I just wanted something that spoke to me. And so harvest of 2014, we had brought some Syrah from French Creek Vineyard in for sleight of hand. And I was filling a barrel of Syrah in the middle of harvest in 2014. And I just loved how that barrel smelled. And it just kind of spoke to me right then. And I knew that there was Mourvedre planted there. And so while filling this barrel, I texted Damon, who manages the vineyard, and asked if that Mourvedre was available. And he said, sure. And so then our conversation for the next harvest. And so our conversation went from there to, well, I love co-fermentation. I love the idea of co-fermentation. I think that, I don't know that it's always greater than the sum of its parts, but I think that there's something there's something that really speaks to me about field blends. And so I just started talking to him. And so I picked up the 2 little blocks of Mourvedre, and then I picked up a block of Syrah next to it, and then a row of Grenache Blanc, just right there too. And so French Creek Vineyard, the original planting there, so this is a Yakima Valley site. So Eastern Yakima Valley, it's about 15 miles the other side of Red Mountain. So it's about an hour and 5 minutes from Walla Walla, from where I'm sitting right now. And it is planted, the original block was some 1978 planted Chardonnay, Wente clone Chardonnay, which we work with for sleight of hand. There's 10 acres of that. And then in the early 90s, they planted like 3 acres of Cabernet. And so that was it for a long time. And then in 2012 or 2013, Damon started planting out this kind of east-facing draw, So relatively steep east-facing slope with Rhone varieties. And so he planted, and I don't think he really thought it through when he did, he planted Mourvedre at the very northern end, and it's where the draw kind of curved. And so the Mourvedre, which is, a late ripening grape, is planted on a northeast facing slope.
A cool site, basically, a very cool site.
Yes, yeah, so it's a moderate heat site, but it becomes a very cool site because of that aspect, because of the lack of sun exposure. And again, I don't think Damon thought this through, but I actually don't think, I think 8 years out of 10, I don't think you'd be able to get the Mourvedre above 14% alcohol even if you tried. So I'm picking 12.5 to 13% alcohol, potential alcohol fruit in October. And I don't think Damon thought that through, because for most conventional winemakers, this site would not work. But I love it because it gives me all this hang time, and I still have the alcohol levels where I'm looking for, which brings the freshness and brings the expression that I like. And so these vines are, one block of the Mourvedre is head trained, kind of classic Goblet. And then I've got the small block, which is what I make the Sans Souffle from, which is, it's not head trained, it's tight spacing. It is, it's a interesting training system because I don't even know what it's called. In fact, I don't know if it has a name. Basically the trunks come up about 2.5, 3 feet. And then he took one cordon and he spiraled it up a post from 3 feet to about 7 feet. And then it's spur pruned all up and down this, this cordon, but it means my fruiting zone goes from 3 feet up to 7 feet. And so all of the shoots kind of come off like this all the way down. And so we keep about 16 shoots. And they all are carrying fruit all up and down this canopy. So they're on all sides of the canopy. They're on top to bottom. And what I really love about it is that it gives me this huge variety and ripeness. So, when I'm picking, mid-October usually on French Creek Red, half the fruit is riper than I want, half is, less ripe than I want, or one third, and 1/3's right where I would ideally pick it. But I love what that brings to the final product. I don't want my fruit to all look the same. I know, you see these pictures of these beautiful VSP vineyards in California where all the Cabernet is all identical, and in Washington too. I have zero interest in making wine from fruit like that. So for me, the variation is the key. And that's also why I love the co-fermentation aspect, because the Syrah I bring in, which is an early ripening grape, is much riper than the Mourvedre. But I pick based on, because it's the biggest percentage, I pick based on the Mourvedre, and based on tasting that, I don't sample the Syrah. I just taste it and make sure it looks good. So that's French Creek.
What kind of steepness are we talking about? Like this,
it's
this?
Steep. It's very, especially the Sans Souffle block. I don't know the exact degree of slope, but it's you're looking at this. It's a very steep block, and it is planted in mostly kind of a coarser silt loam, with some little patches of gravel here and there, but mostly kind of a classic Washington State silt loam or basalt. So, and then moving east, the next vineyard over would be Weather Eye, and Weather Eye is a fascinating site. And again, the first thing what I always like to talk about with Weather Eye is the manager, Ryan Johnson. And again, his crew of 16 have been with him on average 15 years. This is somebody that I have the utmost respect for, as does everyone in Washington State. And even if he didn't farm the way I like, just that fact alone and how loyal his crew is and how well taken care of they are means so much, especially in, not that it means more these days, but the awareness is so much greater about, where things are coming from and who's actually putting this wine on the table. And so I just so appreciate what Ryan does with his crew. And so that's the first thing with Weather Eye. Second thing with Weather Eye is it is easily the most ambitious and exciting vineyard project in Washington State right now. So Weather Eye Vineyard is planted at the very top of Red Mountain. Red Mountain is a very hot site, obviously. So Weather Eye is planted at the top of Red Mountain. Most vineyards on Red Mountain are 700 to 800 feet elevation. Weather Eye is 12 to 1300 feet elevation. And then the other thing he did, and where I source fruit from, is he planted the north slope of Red Mountain as well. So it's not in the Red Mountain AVA, it's actually Columbia Valley, because the AVA line follows the crest of the hill. But Ryan's put in, he's got about, I don't know, maybe 45 acres in the ground right now. And I think it represents almost 60 individual unique blocks. And so this place is micromanaged like you can't believe. And no two blocks are planted to the same spacing, the same training system, the same variety, the same soil type. It's just this fascinating laboratory for growing grapes, and growing grapes on different slopes and different aspects and different soils. You know, he's got some rocky blocks, he's got sandy blocks, he's got blocks that are so loam. So there's just this huge variety up there, and he's working with everything from Graziano to Rhone whites to Rhone reds to some Bordeaux varieties. He's been trying to convince me on one of the steep north slopes to put in some sparkling varieties, although I've told him no. But it's just too hot. But once again, I get the north slope, which on average on Red Mountain at Weather Eye is 8 to 10 degrees cooler during the day than the south slope, which gives me a little more hang time. But this is not cool like French Creek. I'm picking Weather Eye in early to mid-September, early September on the Rousson and mid-September for the Reds, versus October on French Creek. So this is quite a bit warmer site. But again, it's just it's the most visually striking and the most fascinating site in Washington today. Well, a couple other things that Ryan's done. He did not remove any native plants when he put the vineyard in. So it means when you're walking a row of Graziano, you'll come to a space where there are 5 vines missing, because that space is filled by a big patch of rabbit brush or sagebrush. And so instead of removing those, he simply just planted a vine on one side and a vine on the other side. In fact, there's one block of Grenache that we work with for sleight of hand that's like, I think it's 25 to 30% sagebrush covering the surface area, and he's planted all around it. And so it's
incredibly
really cool.
Progressive.
What?
It sounds incredibly progressive.
Yes, and so
to make.
Yes, he just is very he's very thoughtful and very respectful, and it's not something he'd ever done before. When he established Force Majeure Vineyard, which is just a little bit down the slope from where we're talking now, they did remove those plants, and he went through and he ripped it and he got it all prepared. And with Weather Eye, he doesn't do any of that. He just he takes what the ground gives him. And once again, what I appreciate about it is there's so much attention to detail. He walked that entire property. He'll walk it himself, and he finds where things can grow and where things can't, where the soil changes, and he flags stuff. And so he's got, I talk about 55 or 60 blocks, and he's probably got another 20 flagged out for future plantings potentially. He doesn't know if he'll ever get to them, but he knows where they are. He's also fascinating to visit because he's the only vineyard manager whose work truck smells like lavender. He always has lavender sprigs hanging from his rearview mirror, and he worries as much about. Sometimes it feels like when you go up there that you spend more time talking about and identifying wildflowers than you do talking about the grapes. So we tend to go through and we each try to identify the wildflowers we see, and he's much better at it than I am. But it's pretty fun. We'll see a dozen different kinds of flowers and 5 different kinds of native grasses and all the sagebrush, all the rabbit brush. He obsesses over the curve of his access roads. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you run into up there. And so a visit to Weather Eye is never just a quick check-in on your grapes. It's a 2-hour event riding around in the truck with Ryan and talking about farming and philosophy and life and art and aesthetics, and that's Weather Eye.
And where do you see your wine from, the wine from Weather Eye, where do you see that going in terms of like aromatics and textures and that sort of thing? What are you finding?
So the thing about Weather Eye is it's the desert. I mean, you're talking about this beautiful piece of Eastern Washington desert. And so for me, the key to making wine from there, especially the red wine, skin contact on whites always kind of changes the picture. But for the red wine, to me, that wine just echoes the desert. You know, it just really is a wine of its place. There's this kind of there's this restrained power to it, and there's this kind of stark beauty, and the cool thing that I always find with it, it has like this inner mouth perfume that just makes me think of those wildflowers, of that sagebrush. And you know, it might just be that I know it's there, and so I pick it up. But you know, perception is such an interesting thing. So
Keith, at the moment, we have the red blend Weather Eye in stock.
Mhm.
Do you have more of that available too?
I do have a little bit more of that, and I actually need to, I'll shoot you a note after this about some more of that as well. But yes, I do have a little bit more. I think I've got about 20 cases left of that wine.
Okay, because we have that and the French Creek, but then the other vineyard is the, is it Solesis Vineyard?
The white Pinot Noir, and that is, the 19 is gone, and the 2020, you know, here's one more thing in the evolution of the winemaking. The 2019 didn't finish malolactic, so I filtered that wine. But starting in 2020, I've committed, I don't want to filter anything ever again, and so I'm waiting for the 2020 to finish malolactic. And so we'll see if it gets there. I don't know. It tastes pretty good right now, but I'd like it to be finished through malolactic before making a decision. I'm hoping it'll be this spring, but we'll see what the wine wants to do.
So we still have some of that, the Pinot Noir, the white Pinot Noir in stock. Could you tell us a little bit about that vineyard? Is it?
Yeah, so Salaxon Vineyard is up in the, it's in the brand new Royal Slope AVA. And how that came about is that I guess he was her fiance at the time, but my assistant winemakers at Sleight of Hand, her fiance is the viticulturist at Salaxon. He's also a winemaker. And he had this idea that we would make wine together. And it was a great idea. I mean, especially after a few too many bottles one night. And so we were thinking how to make wine together, what wine to make. And he wanted to make Viognier, but he wanted old vines, and there just wasn't going to happen. And so we kind of shelved this idea. I was like, you know what, Matthias, if we get a ton of grapes together, we'll make wine together. It sounds great. And Matthias is Chilean. And so I get a text from Matthias right before harvest, 2018. And he said, hey, I've got it. Let's make Pinot Blanc. I'm like, Pinot Blanc? All right, whatever. It's a 1 ton. We'll have some fun with this. And it was going to be from one of his vineyards. And then he followed up that text. He said, oh, not Pinot Blanc. I mean, white Pinot Noir. And I said, oh, really? But again, it was like, well, let's just see how it turns out. It's 50 cases, whatever. And so about a week later, he literally calls me and he says, hey, I need you to go pick up that fruit tomorrow because it's ready. And so I went up this, again, 2018 vintage. So I went and picked up the Pinot Noir, brought it back, whole cluster pressed it, made this lovely white Pinot Noir. We made 50 cases, we each had 25. It was gone in a flash. People really liked it. And that was great. And so 2019, we decided to make, we made 3 or 4 times as much, more than that, made quite a bit more. But what happened in 2019 is we got the fruit back here. And this was when we kind of reached a point where I was gonna have more volume of it. And Matthias and my winemaking ideas and styles diverged too much. And I wasn't, so we decided to just go. So we pressed off the juice together and we each made our own wine in 2019. So Salaxon Vineyard is a great site, high elevation, relatively cool. They grow quite a bit of sparkling grapes at that site. So I know a couple wineries are making traditional method sparkling with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir planted there. But here's the other thing is it's in the middle of nowhere, and it's a 2 hour and 15-minute drive for me. And so I don't work with it any. 2019 was the last vintage from Salaxon, not because I didn't love the wine or the result. You know, it's a very well-farmed vineyard, all sustainable, things that I appreciate, but I just wasn't comfortable with a site that was so far away. I couldn't go walk the rows whenever I felt like I couldn't, do these things. And so with 2020, I actually moved the sourcing for the Pinot Noir to a vineyard planted in the foothills of the Blues at 1,800 feet elevation called Breezy Slope. And so my 2020 white Pinot will be coming from Walla Walla instead.
What is white Pinot?
It's just Pinot Noir that we whole cluster press. So no skin contact Pinot Noir.
So it's kind of like when people make champagne and they use Pinot.
Yes, it absolutely is. So that's exactly what it is. So just a whole cluster press Pinot Noir. And I am not interested in utilizing anything to minimize the color. So the color is what it is for me.
What is the color? Is it kind of like it's like between a rosé and a white wine?
Yeah, so the 2019 definitely has a kind of a blush to it, kind of like a very pale rosé. But for instance, the 2020 from Breezy Slope gave me less color. It's almost completely white. And
so you direct press it, but sometimes even with direct press, the pigment gives off a little bit of color.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And there are ways to counter that. Again, I'm just not interested in any of them. So the color I get is the color I get.
And then I know that you're really excited about the vineyard in the Blue Mountains, right?
Yes. So, and then the site that I might be the most excited about, in fact, I am potentially looking into buying some property up there, is Lewis Peak. And Lewis Peak Vineyard is it takes me about 30 minutes to get there from the winery. But it's about 12 miles east of where I'm sitting right now. And it is 3,000 feet elevation. It's the highest elevation commercial vineyard in Washington State. I say commercial vineyard, it's kind of commercial. It's 3 acres. Planted half to Riesling, half to Malbec, and we're able to dry farm up there. So the thing to know about Lewis Peak is not only are you very high elevation and dry farmed, it is also incredibly windy up there. The wind blows all the time. It never stops blowing. So I end up with berries the size of my pinky nail. And the Malbec this year, because of that wind, I would have a cluster, it looked like a full-size cluster, and it would have 8 berries on it. That was the Malbec 2020 up there. And so you just have to accept that. And you have to know that there is no consistency or reliability in yields. And but there's something about it. The site just really is kind of a magic place. And so with the wind helping us, we basically go a no spray program. I think we sprayed sulfur once for mildew last year, so in 2020, and we're able to farm perfectly clean fruit. All weeds are mechanically, are hand hoed basically. And I took that vineyard completely organic in 2020. So I farmed that vineyard with the owner and with the help of a local crew when I need extra hands up there. And again, this site, I think when I talk about sites that interest me and sites that I think pushing the boundaries of Washington, this is the most boundary pushing site that I've ever seen. It's not in any AVA, so it's Washington State, because nobody ever thought you would grow grapes at 3,000 feet elevation in the Blue Mountains. And so it's planted in silt loam, all luss, so windblown silt loam, and relatively deep soils. I think we've got about 10 feet of soil up there, which helps with allowing us to dry farm because it holds some water for us. And so it comes in very late. So I picked Riesling and Malbec the same day in 2020, and I picked them on October 25th, October 26th, the day before a hard freeze. In fact, there was a skiff of snow on the ground as we were picking the grapes, and I came out with fruit with about 19.5%, about 11.5% potential alcohol, picked on October 25th in Washington State. So there's no guarantees up there, but for that reason, it appeals to me even more because, and it also impacts the wines that you can make and the wines that you can't make. I had this idea when I first started working with it in 19 that I'd make a still red wine out of the Malbec, and I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think the Malbec will always be sparkling of some sort.
I can't think of any other vineyard region in Washington other than maybe the Gorge where there's there's no dry farm, or there's dry farming going on. Most of it's irrigation. So is that, I mean, that's pretty unique for Washington, right?
It's very unique for Washington. The gorge, there are some sites in the gorge. There's obviously the Puget Sound. And then the very eastern edge of the Walla Walla Valley, you can dry farm, and that's the only places you can dry farm. So there's some stuff up the Mill Creek drainage about 15 to 1,700 feet elevation that is dry farmed, and you can dry farm. Where I'm pulling that Pinot Noir at Breezy Slope, you could dry farm. He's set up to irrigate. I don't think he turned the water on at all this last year. And then, Lewis Peak, and that's it. And so for outside of the gorge, for true Eastern Washington vineyard sort sites, this is the only place you can dry farm.
And what about that Breezy Slope, that site, and in relationship to smoke events, fire events, and guai calls and stuff like that? Is that because it's so high and so far? Is it impacted by a smoke event or not really?
I'm going to pass on that question. No, I'm just kidding. Smoke is very much a story of the vintage in 2020 in Washington. Everybody else shared their fires with us and shared their smoke from their fires with us, and we're very fortunate. Obviously, I can't imagine what growers in Oregon and California are dealing with right now, and did deal with through all of it. And so we got a little bit of smoke and they got devastation. So I guess I'll take a little bit of smoke. There's going to be smoke in some Washington wines. As of right now, I made a little bit with the Pinot. I didn't whole cluster press all of it. I made a little bit of skin contact Pinot Noir from up there, just a few barrels. And I'm not going to test anything. I don't, it is what it is. Sensory wise, there might be a little bit of a smoky note on the macerated Pinot Noir. And it is the one lot in the cellar for sleight of hand and Devium that I definitely am questioning whether we have a bit of smoke. I think there's a low level across other varieties. And I think it's going to be a case of there will be smoke will pop up some places, especially susceptible varieties. But I think there's enough material in most of the wines, and the smoke is at a low enough level that sensory-wise, you're not getting a lot of smoke in the 2020s from Washington. I have tasted a few things and sat in on some webinars and seen some stuff where I definitely could pick up the smoke that was there. But I'm not seeing widespread smoke that concerns me in our cellar. But once again, if there was, I'm not going to do anything to try to correct it. So the option would be to blend it somehow to minimize the smoke impact. But yes, so I do think that the elevation didn't help. The smoke was everywhere. So I do think that I probably have more smoke compounds, and it's a very complex topic. Very little understood as actually even. But I definitely think the Pinot Noir, which is known to be more susceptible, I think the macerated Pinot might have a small smoky impact. But I also have never worked with the site. It was whole cluster, so it might just be a little bit of smoky whole cluster notes, and that's what we're going to tell everyone.
Well, I think that's the advantage to working with Rhone varieties, right? Because you kind of expect almost the varietal character with a whole cluster to produce some kind of smoky character.
Absolutely, and I think honestly, my wines and all the Rhones we make for sleight of hand, we're not concerned about it at all, because it's low enough level that it's not. If it's there, we know there are compounds there. We just don't know if they've reached sensory or what compounds we have or all of those things. Again, it's a very complex topic. But yes, I'm not concerned about Rhone varieties at all. Any kind of smoke we might get is going to be such low level it'll just come across as being part of the wine.
So Keith, I think we're going to open up now to the audience for other people to have any questions to ask you.
Absolutely.
Everyone, you're muted, so feel free to unmute and jump in if you have any questions for Keith.
Keith, I got a question for you right away. I'm curious to know what your experiences are like as a winemaker working in these lower interventional style methods amongst, your Walla Walla community and like Washington in general. There's not a whole lot of people working this way, or in Washington. I feel like, organic farming hasn't really caught up too much yet, and neither has the winemaking styles. So are you experiencing any friction? Like what's going on?
Well, so I'm pretty fortunate in that I get along with most people pretty well. So I don't get a lot of friction. I get a lot of eye rolls, and I get a lot of shrugs, and I get a lot of confused looks. But people tend to, at least to my face, tend to be fairly supportive. Again, they're not going to jump on board, and they don't really believe in what I'm doing, and they don't, but they're interested in trying the wines. I mean, I get a lot of curiosity. A lot of people want to know what my wine tastes like and want to know how I made it and all this kind of stuff. But again, more I get a lot of kind of people, again, eye rolls and shrugs, and like you don't really know what you're talking about. We've been making wine here for 20 years, and we can sell our wine, and it's a big oaky Merlot. What do you have? It's Washington. It's part of the reason of even starting this project is that, and I don't want to speak ill, and I don't want to generalize, but there has been a tendency in Washington State that people tend to pick at the same ripeness levels, and they use the same yeast, the same cultured yeast, and they use the same barrels in relatively the same proportions, and they age their wine for roughly the same amount of time. And so there's a lot of homogeneity in Washington wine. In fact, it was, I'm starting to, not to again speak ill of anyone, but I'm starting to see it more and more, and now that I'm more aware of it, in a lot of regions. So it's not like it's just Washington, because I'm finding your classic Willamette Valley Pinot Noir to have some of the same problems that I find in Washington, conventional Washington wine producers. And it's not to say those wines aren't good. They're delicious. They've got an audience. People like them. It's just not what I want to drink anymore. So anyway, the answer is no friction, but lots of curiosity and lots of people just kind of brushing it off and thinking that I'm out of my mind.
That's good. Thanks.
Hi, Keith. How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So I want to tag on to Andrew's question. Have you had anybody ask, have another layer of curiosity and wanted to learn a little more about what you're doing in the region?
Yeah, there's a handful of producers, mostly younger producers, who are starting to explore this a little bit. Usually not their whole program, but they'll try it with a wine or two here and there. I don't think anyone's really taking it as far as I typically take things, but there are definitely people exploring these ideas and these and kind of these themes. It's interesting, and everyone has different levels and what they're comfortable with and where they want to take stuff. And so there is starting to be a little bit of that, but there's not a lot yet. And I do think in general in Washington, when people start talking minimal intervention or non-intervention, what they actually mean when they say it is very different than what a crowd like this would mean when they say it. So that's something I definitely see in Washington too, is, when we're talking about these methods and this direction of winemaking, what somebody else's interpretation of minimal intervention is very different than mine. And so I see a lot of that as well. You're using cultured yeast, you're not minimal intervention. And I know a lot of people that think those two things can live alongside of each other. And this is obviously a very complicated topic, and everyone needs to make wine the way they make wine. And I hope they all find their market and are successful, and they can do what they want. But anyway, so that's another layer of kind of minimal intervention or non-intervention winemaking in Washington.
Connected with that, what about yeast nutrients? Because I feel like that seems very commonly used in Washington wines. And can you tell us what a yeast nutrient is and why people use it or how it works?
Yeah, so yeast nutrients. So the most commonly used yeast nutrient is diammonium phosphate, and the reason you use yeast nutrients is that your fruit is coming into the cellar without enough nutrients to finish fermentation. And part of the reason for that is that in Washington, we're in the desert and our soils just are naturally low in nutrients. Part of the reason for that is that you're picking at 25, 26 bricks and you're expecting to make a 15.5% alcohol wine, which is obviously much harder for yeast to do. So in Washington in general, we have very low levels of yeast available nitrogen that comes into the fruit. So you can add some DAP and you can bring those levels up to a level where your yeast can complete a 15.5% alcohol fermentation. What happens though, and this is the interesting thing for me, and this is a complicated topic again, and one that I spend probably more time thinking about than is really healthy. So the thing is that those nitrogen compounds that are coming in with your fruit are very different from the nitrogen compounds that you're adding with DAP. And part of what builds complexity and creates flavor in wine is how yeast actually utilizes those nitrogen compounds. And it's all nitrogen compounds. So anything yeast consumes sugar and creates alcohol, but to do it, it also needs this nitrogen. And when it uses these different nitrogens, different amino acids, it creates different aromatics and different flavor profiles. If you give your yeast all DAP, all they're going to utilize is DAP because it's like candy for yeast. So, you know, the nitrogen sources that come in with the grapes are like broccoli, and the nitrogen sources that you get from DAP is like birthday cake. And so if given the choice, the yeast is only going to consume the birthday cake. And what ends up happening is you homogenize the flavor profiles and the aromatic compounds and the complexities because your yeast was not forced to use these more complex nitrogens. Anyway, that is a topic we can have any time. I do use, when a fermentation needs a little boost, I sometimes use some spent yeast holes, organic yeast holes that I'll throw in there if I feel like a ferment could use a little help. Something I learned, you know, go back to when I said I wasn't giving my yeast necessarily all the care they need sometimes. That is one of the things I've implemented to use to keep a little bit healthier fermentation, but I only use those as necessary and in very small amounts. And it's an organic product that's made up of old yeast. So
that's interesting. So that is, so, you know, the obvious ones we always ask is like whether people are using native yeast or cultured yeast, but it sounds like yeast nutrients are another component that is commonly used that maybe we just need to think about because it's not necessarily part of a minimal intervention winemaking approach.
Yes, it's not. So there is an argument against it, of course. And some people will make this argument, and their argument is that the low yan is more true to the terroir of Washington State, and that if you are actively increasing your yan levels, whether that be with organic concepts or with if you're using compost or things like that, that can increase the yan levels that come in with the fruit, that you are actually having a bigger impact on the finished product. I don't believe that. I think that DAP is a much worse thing than green compost or doing following some of these more regenerative farming practices, which can raise your yan levels.
I mean, like, is this improving your farming and your soil?
Yes.
Washington State is associated with bad soil.
Yes. So people, it is a complex conversation though, because I've had this conversation with people where they think that adding compost is changing the terroir, whereas using DAP is not. And so,
no, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's just important for us. The reason we want to ask you these things is just that it gives us a context for understanding wines as we taste them and why they might be of a certain character, and I think that's one thing that I remember Luke and I, when we first met you, we tasted your Sancerre wine and it just was mind-blowing. And I think that Luke, you can speak to this more maybe, but it really just, I think it was the closest thing to a Rhone wine that we had ever tasted. I mean, it was much closer to Rhone than Washington. And so I think that really blew us away because we felt like we saw this potential in Washington that we hadn't really experienced from tasting other wines made in the region. What do you think, Luke? Do you want to jump in? I think that was
the Sancerre wine from 2016?
That's what we tasted when we first met, and it was sold out, but I brought a bottle, and
Right.
then we had the 2018, obviously, which you worked with.
I mean, I think tasting that wine is, is the kind of the lightest, freshest, brightest, Rhone style wine I've tasted from Washington up until that point. And it was, it gave me the confidence that, Washington has some really exciting things ahead, I think. And, going from that wine to like, what's next, and the arc of your winemaking, like where do you see things going in the next, 5 to 10 years? With sites,
So the answer is I don't know. What it has done, I can tell you, again, there's these little evolutions all the time, and also trying to stay true and honest to what I want to do. I have found that I'm using less and less sulfur every year, and assuming the wines can handle it. So, for instance, as of right now, the 2020 vintage is all sans soufre as of now. I've not used any sulfur for any of the 2020s to this point. Not to say I won't. I'm using less of it, and I'm trying to keep my wine safe and sound other ways. Again, the biggest thing for me right now, the biggest thing I'm concentrating on is healthy fermentations while staying true to the way I want to make wine. And so that's like my big focus right now, and that's why I think about yeast nutrients way more than I really should. Is because how to always have healthy ferments without utilizing the crutch of yeast nutrients, while also not being directly in control of all the farming, to necessarily always be able to increase my YAN levels is something that I spend an awful lot of time on, and it's something I contemplate a lot.
Are there some things that that you can, is there a certain amount of influence on your growers that can help those, yeast available nutrients that that you're seeing them putting into practice?
Yeah, definitely one of the things that we've worked on, especially at French Creek, is cover crops and mowing instead of complete weed removal, things like that. Mowing, not mowing. This is again very complicated topic, but allowing some of that green compost back into the soil and building up our soil profile and building up our soil health is something that I've worked with Damon on quite a bit. We for sure do it up at Lewis Peak. Weather is a different thing because it truly is the desert. I mean, they're the native plants, but he's not going to put in a non-native cover crop or something to work that direction. So it's a matter of having these conversations and pushing for, utilizing some compost and things. And it's a conversation we have all the time. Now, I'm fortunate in that the alcohol levels I'm picking at, I typically can get everything dry without too much trouble. But again, it's something that I'm very conscientious of and thinking about all the time, because if you don't get dry, you can't make wine the way I want to make wine, right? If something doesn't go dry in most people's winery, they restart it or they filter it or they do things to it, but I can't. I've got to get everything dry. And so that is, yes, so working on the farming side to get there, which hopefully at some point, when I'm not making, or when I have a bigger crew and can focus more and farm some of my own sites, which is something that's definitely in the picture down the road. It's something that I can control from start to finish, which should be great.
Well, thank you for your time. If anyone has any questions, please jump in now. Anything?
I have a question. Hi, Keith. Thank you again. My question is, so this is definitely would be something maybe thought about in the years to come, but I feel like I'm seeing more and more like Piquette styles. So I was just seeing like what sort of evolution you hope for Devium Wines. when you were talking about the Weather Eye site, I just kept thinking like with all the natural flora around, like doing some sort of aromatized wine would be really cool, especially if you could use some of those plants in the area, and just sort of your thoughts on either piquette or doing like an aromatized style.
Absolutely. So I'll answer the aromatized first, because Ryan tries to throw some sagebrush into the bins every time. No, he really does. And in fact, with one of the wines, the first vintage from another producer, had an overwhelming sage note to it. I tasted it from barrel. And it was definitely because Ryan was a little heavy-handed there. And that was an interesting experience. I think the idea is really, really cool. I actually was just having this conversation yesterday with 2 days ago with some of my with the office staff here at Sleight of Hand about like using herbs and using different things. And the problem that I have with it is to get it right takes so much trial and error, and is such a precise practice. And personally, I would I just think that I don't want to make a wine that I have to be that precise with, if that makes sense. For me, it's more about feel and more about letting the wine be. If I could just throw some sage in and it would work out and it would taste great, and I knew it would, like, I could see doing that. And I'm intrigued by the idea, but I also know that great producers of vermouth experiment and record everything, and they find what works and what doesn't work. And I love the discipline required for that, but for me, it's not really where I'm at right now. But I do, no. So that's an interesting one. Piquette is also interesting. So as of right now, I have no plans to make any Piquette. I guess in theory, I love the idea of Piquette, but I love the idea of Piquette as something you drink in the place. I have a problem. I'm struggling already with the carbon footprint of winemaking, and this is something that I really, really struggle with. It's probably my single biggest kind of existential crisis that pops up all the time. And sometimes I question whether I should even be making wine or bottling wine, and I assuage my conscience however I can. Piquette for me, if you're going to put it in glass bottles and ship it all over the country or all over the world, I just have I have a problem with it. I love the idea that you're reusing a byproduct.
You gotta put it in cans, Keith. Aluminum cans are have the lowest carbon footprint, because it's almost like 99% recyclable.
I know, and I appreciate that, and I actually do. So cans are the one exception, or kegs. If you could do a keg program.
I was just going to ask you about kegs. We would love to have some kegs here in Seattle.
Oh, word. That is a maybe on kegs. Cans, I don't have a way to can anything right now. There's not without the investment of getting my own canning line, nobody's really doing that here except for a mass scale, like at giant winemaking facilities. But yes, I've been thinking about cans, and honestly, if I didn't have this romantic side, I think all my wine would be in cans already. But there's this idea of making wine that you age in bottle and open in 10 years. And I haven't quite shaken that yet. But it's moving that direction. We'll see.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course. Anything else? Happy to answer any and all questions. I'm good here for a little while longer, so.
So regarding the kosher wine, how did you have a rabbi come in to supervise is there someone there right now that's supervising that?
Yeah, so the rabbi just finished. So this is a project for Sleight of Hand, and we did it 2019 and now 2020. Kosher wine is interesting. So we can't touch.
Is it mavushal?
I'm sorry?
Is it mavushal?
No, it is not. It is non-mashubal. It's kosher for Passover, but it is not boiled. It's not cooked. But the fascinating thing is, from the minute the grapes have been destemmed, nobody who doesn't practice kosher and been approved by a rabbi can handle the fruit at all. So any process that needs to be done is done by a rabbi or by somebody that he is allowing, that he trusts to do that process. So we bring the fruit in, we can destem it, and we destem it into a bin. But from that moment on, we don't handle it unless it's sealed. And so the rabbi and the representatives of this company that we're making this for, they come in, they handle every process. So when it's time to punch down, they come in, they punch down. And when they're not here, the bins, the fermentation bins or the tanks or the kegs are sealed up and have kosher seals on them. And if any of those seals are broken when they come back, the wine's no longer kosher. I mean, so the rabbi literally we cleaned everything. Everything has to be cleaned to an extreme degree beforehand too. So we cleaned everything before he got here. And by we, I mean Taylor. And then the rabbi actually did every process with Taylor pointing and telling him what to do. So the kosher Syrah that we made in 2020 just finished malolactic. And so he was here to remove the fermentation bungs, top everything completely up, add sulfur, and put in hard bungs. And so that's what he just finished up doing. And so, but I can't handle it. So for instance, pulling a sample, and that's why I have this is the Syrah. He pulled that sample for me and gave it to me. But now that I've handled this, I wouldn't, even if this was a pitcher, I can't put it back in. It can't go back anywhere. So everything is, it's a very interesting, it's been an interesting project. I think the actual physical practice of doing it has not been the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing has just been talking with these, we've had 3 or 4 different rabbis through here in the last year and a half. We've got our main Rabbi Galler, who was here just now. They're all fascinating people who all have this interesting perspective on their religion and what they practice and what they believe. And it's been really fascinating to pick their brains a little bit about, Orthodox and kosher and all of that stuff. It's been really cool.
And where is the wine eventually headed?
It'll all be headed to, basically it's all going to be sold in kosher markets in New York and New Jersey. So we'll be bottling the 2019 Cabernet next month, and we'll ship it straight to Ari in New York, and he's pre-sold all of it. So people are desperate for good kosher wine, and the only good kosher wine, there's very little of it out there, and it's all coming from Israel at this point. Not all. Careful there. Somebody might have no great kosher wine, but there's just not a lot of options. And so really the idea is having quality kosher wine. And then also it's also great for the people who are not as strict but then want to practice kosher for Passover and things like that, because then they can drink wine of a quality they're used to instead of, drinking some terrible wine, because it's a big part of the tradition and a big part of the holidays is the wine drinking.
Sleight of hand, raising the bar on kosher wine.
I certainly hope so. It's pretty tasty. I mean, it's not, again, you can't, because I can't handle anything, can't do anything, and can't be as present with it. You can't really make wine like I would want to make wine to the full degree. But it's awfully good. It's pure and it's fresh, and I think it's fun wine.
Very cool. Well, thanks for taking us through that.
Of course.
I think maybe we wrap up.
Absolutely. Again, any more questions? I'm happy to answer them. And thanks for having me.
Just for the record, before we end, I think we should all take an immediate field trip to where Sheila is. I'm missing the palm trees in the background. Looks amazing.
Oh.
I am in Palm Springs. I don't have the video on because I'm dealing with my dog right now, but yeah. I'm sorry, you guys.
We're all coming where you are.
It's 25 and foggy here in Walla Walla, so that's really nice.
I know. I mean, COVID's really bad here, so we're kind of stuck at the house, which is fine because there's a pool, but everything's closed down. I know. You shouldn't feel sorry for me.
Well, thank you, Keith, and we'll be in touch with you soon about the new releases you have coming up. I think, is it going to be the Pet Nat?
So I've got the Pet Nat, and then I think you have samples of the 2019 Roussan and 2019 Sansouf. And then whenever the 2020 white Pinot decides to finish fermenting, that will be there. And then sometime late spring, I'll have 2019 French Creek Red, but I've got 2018, so don't worry about that.
Okay. And then at some point maybe a Riesling Pet Nat.
And then at some point the Riesling Pet Nat as well in a very tiny quantity, but yes. And yeah, so that's kind of what I've got.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to save this recording and post it up to our new Walden YouTube channel so that it'll be there for archival purposes.
Perfect.
And then we're going to also like to organize, when it's safe to do so, a time to bring our team and some buyers up to visit you and visit the vineyards, if that's possible.
Absolutely. Of course, anything, whenever whenever that kind of thing is allowed again, I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.